Soldiers lay dying in the sweltering heat of 1778. Acrid gun smoke from 20,000 muskets hanging in the air, while a barrage of cannons thundered hour after hour overhead. A woman weaves through men and musket balls like a mirage, lugging a precious bucket of life-saving water to soldiers scattered across the broken terrain, her petticoats torn ragged by swampy ravines and cannonballs alike. But even as she returns from yet another harrowing trip to the hidden brook, she sees her own husband collapse into the dirt beside his ragged crew, their cannon falling silent. She dashes forward, takes up the fallen sponge, and plunges it into her bucket, and then into the cannon as it sizzles and hisses its rebuke. Another gunner hoists cartridge and ball into the cannon's spout. The woman rams the charge home, and together they fire. With cannon support, the line holds, and the Battle of Monmouth becomes the first time the Continental Army stands in defiance of the Redcoats in an open field, trading volley for volley and withstanding furious bayonet charges, until the British finally retreat under the cover of night. A draw that felt more like victory than any they had tasted. Rumors of the heroic woman burned through the Army's ranks until General George Washington himself sought her out to commend her bravery and to promote her to sergeant. She was Molly Pitcher. And she may not have existed. Like most American folklore, the story grows from undeniable kernels of truth. Truth the first. Women have followed in the wakes of armies as long as armies have existed. Seamstresses, laundry, cooks, nurses, and yes, sometimes sex work. But often they were following their husbands, brothers, even sons to war, and they were often getting paid and fed by the army. Failing that, then by the individual officers who needed clothing and meals. The British Army of the era actually had an established quota of 5 women of the army allowed per company, resulting in stiff competition to earn one of the very few spots available, and explaining why their virtues were always so heavily extolled when they were mentioned in writing. Truth the second. Muzzle-loaded cannons of the era had to be swabbed with a wet, sheepskin-covered sponge between every single shot to smother any embers which might still be lingering in the barrel and which would otherwise cause a cannon to fire while it was still being loaded. 1 + 2 = 3, cannons, being considerably less maneuverable and considerably more valuable to an army, were typically placed in the rear of an army's lines, a relatively safe position, and being the water gobblers that they were, relied on a steady supply of water, the hauling of which could easily be relegated to anyone of reasonable fitness, like women and children, so that a trained soldier isn't wasting their time. Thus, it's reasonable to assume that Molly Pitcher was an amalgamation of these patriotic camp followers, or women of the army, who ensured that the cannons stayed cool enough to fire. After all, the only first-hand account published in 1830 from a Revolutionary soldier, and since lost, who mentions an unarmed artillery wife swabbing a cannon and having a cannonball fly perfectly between her legs, tearing only her petticoats, is a bit far-fetched. After all, this is the same continental myth-making machine which had the patriotic spy Nathaniel Hale famously declare,
"I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country,"
despite a lack of accounts from primary witnesses to his execution. A patriotic woman fulfilling her husband's duty in a moment of crisis and garnering the acclaim of the general and the entire Continental Army, the propagandist should have had her story ricocheting across the states, especially since that kind of unflinching heroism on behalf of a fledgling nation would have helped erase the other contemporary legacy of Monmouth. Charles Lee. Washington's second-in-command hadn't been with the army at Valley Forge when Baron von Steuben gave them the kind of real army makeover that normally takes a 2-minute movie montage. Lee had been in British custody for 16 months and returned wanting to pursue the same tactics which had vaguely worked for the undisciplined pre-glow-up army. Tactics which, per the ethos of the day and their new French allies, looked a lot like cowardice. To his credit, he did hold a rearguard against some of the bloodiest fighting of the day. But it was after Washington had to personally rally Lee's wildly fleeing troops and play babysitter while establishing the position he wanted Lee to hold so that Washington could go fetch the rest of the army. By afternoon of the 8-ish-hour battle, Lee had been low-key unofficially replaced by von Steuben, which, awkward, but then Lee kept running his mouth, and Quill, to anyone who would listen. And his embarrassing, no-good, terrible day during an otherwise relatively inconsequential draw of a battle became a 2-month court-martial rolling along behind the army like a parade while he tried to defame its commander-in-chief. A contemporaneous story about a baddie avenging her husband and driving off the redcoats would have been a less humiliating thing to attach to a battle where the army managed to not run away. So it's fake, right? Except for Molly Pitcher, we have a real name, and a corresponding paper trail, and her giant tombstone. Mary Ludwig Hayes was there that day at Monmouth. She had joined her husband when he enlisted with the 4th Continental Artillery. She was paid sporadically for her various jobs as a woman of the Army, and later received a pension from the state of Pennsylvania for services rendered rather than a widower's pension. Her dedication to the cause was so well known that the author of her own son's obituary in 1856 mentioned pointing her out in the street as the celebrated heroine Molly Pitcher of Monmouth. Which is why it's weird it wasn't mentioned in the same newspaper for her obit in 32. Meaning that the story itself hadn't spread by 1832. Which moves Molly Pitcher back into the same realm that Rosie the Riveter would occupy more than 100 years later. A representation for all the women of the army who committed their support to the cause in a way that was rarely celebrated, but so utterly necessary for the machine of war to grind on. Unlike the British, Washington refused to set a limit on the number of women of the army. The Continentals simply could not afford to alienate anyone, even if keeping them and their kids around slowed the army's maneuvers a bit. They were worth it, so long as they were virtuous and well-regulated. Some 20,000 women of the army were paid by the Continental Army for their work during the war. They earned rations for themselves and their children. They were listed on the rolls, and they were expected to perform their duties as ordered, just like any regular. During the horrific winter encampment at Valley Forge, when Mary Johnson was court-martialed for plotting to desert the army along with 8 soldiers, she was sentenced to the same 100 lashes as them, and was drummed out of the army, literally getting bullied by the marching band while you walked away in shame. While some of the work performed by women of the army can be hard to retroactively quantify, this is the period where nursing actually became a women's dominated field in the Continental Army. Congress had approved Washington's request to authorize 1 nurse for every 10 patients and 1 supervisory matron per 100, though reaching those numbers was always a struggle. Pay was $8 a month for a nurse, which was less than any officer, but about $1.50 more than an enlisted private, placing them at the same pay level as a sergeant in 1777. That was a year that saw one Mary Priestley serving aboard the Maryland vessel Defense as a nurse. Later that winter, Abigail Hartman Rice was one of the many nurses who braved illnesses such as the typhoid, which eventually killed her, in order to care for soldiers at the Valley Forge Field Hospital of Yellow Springs. Also at Valley Forge was Hannah Till, who alongside her husband was the personal cook leased to George Washington and his general staff. By the next October, they were able to purchase their freedom and continued to cook for Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette through the end of the war. Polly Cooper joined 47 Oneida and Seneca warriors in marching 250 miles through deep snow with bushels of white corn to feed the troops starving after those winter quarters. Also concerned with starving troops was Sarah Osborne Benjamin, who George Washington himself encountered while she was delivering meals to entrenched troops at the siege of Yorktown while artillery flew overhead. And if you're anything like me, hearing nothing but domestic work entirely suitable to women of the age and thinking,
Well, screw that!
Girl, I've got you. How about couriers? 15-year-old Dicey Langston raced 5 miles on foot through a night filled with loyalists and across a flood-swollen river to deliver a warning of impending attack on her brother's militia camp. Emily Geiger had a horse and a letter coordinating the movements of 2 Continental generals when she was apprehended, while riding 48 hours straight over 100 miles. As the British troops sought a loyalist woman to search her, she tore up and ate the letter, and upon her release for lack of evidence, delivered it by memory to its intended destination. Kate Barry's only message was, "Get your ass to Cowpens," as she rode backcountry paths from farm to farm, rallying more than 1,000 militiamen, more than doubling the Continental Army's numbers and leading to a decisive, much-needed victory in the occupied Southern Theater. Nancy Hart didn't even have to leave her home. The Tories barged straight in, demanding she feed them. As they drank from her larder, she started passing their guns to her children waiting outside, then ordered the soldiers to surrender as she aimed the last musket. They didn't, and in 1912, a railroad crew uncovered a neat little row of skeletons a mile from her old cabin. You like Spies? Elizabeth Bergen posed as a charitable, tender-hearted resident of occupied New York City, receiving permission to visit the overcrowded, disease-ridden makeshift prisons where thousands of Patriot soldiers were confined. She was able to smuggle tools, disguises, and information for months, assisting with the escape of an estimated 200 prisoners of war and eventually needing to flee with a 200-pound bounty placed on her head, which was worth 20 years of wages to an enlisted British regular, after which she was fed and housed by Congress on the personal written request from Washington. Elizabeth Martin offered the hospitality and medical care of her home to both sides, but the information she heard always found its way to Continental ears. Super low-key stuff, until she caught wind of a British courier's route nearby with a pair of guards. Her daughters-in-law, Rachel and Grace, tossed on their husbands' clothes and laid an ambush. The British trio stayed the night at the Martins' house, lamenting the loss of their dispatch and weapons to a pair of enterprising colonial lads, while colonial officers were reading every document. Anne Bates would disguise herself as a peddler to freely wander army camps, counting up soldiers, supplies, and the status of their weaponry. She even secured the information which led to the successful defense of Rhode Island against her fellow colonials. If you prefer stories where Tory-loving royalists go boom instead, Martha Bratton was holding a cache of gunpowder for her husband's South Carolina militia as the Redcoats were closing in on Charleston. And knowing there was no time to secure it for the colonials, she laid a line of it down like a Looney Tunes character and set it alight as the British arrived to seize it. Even when her young son was threatened and a sickle was held to her throat, she pulled a,
"Tell Sassy I wanted to know it was me."
Betty Zane was in the besieged Fort Henry as the powder dwindled on the second day. She volunteered to race the 100 open yards from the fort to a storage house secretly full of powder. The 300 British Rangers and their native allies couldn't believe their eyes when a girl dashed out from the fort's southern sally port, and they let her pass without a shot. But as she sprinted back with all the gunpowder she could carry, she was met with a volley of musket fire. Prudence Wright gathered a few dozen of her besties, raided their dudes' closets, and started patrolling around the town as their own militia, while their Minutemen had marched for the battles of Lexington and Concord. They even arrested a pair of loyalist spies and a British Army captain. Then the town paid them for their work under that captain's name, because dunking on your opponents isn't new. Neither is dressing as a guy so you can fight for what you believe in. Enlisting in the Revolutionary War only really required the ability to tear a black powder cartridge with your teeth, and hands functional enough to load a musket. There weren't exactly physicals. Enlisted soldiers slept in their uniforms and rarely had the opportunity to properly bathe. So, a woman like Anna Maria Lane was able to stealthily enlist beside her husband, both joining the Continental Army together in 1776, both getting wounded, her at Germantown, him at the Siege of Savannah, before mustering out in 1781. Deborah Sampson is even more famous because she wrote a book and went on a speaking tour to talk about her 17 months of service before being wounded as a private named Robert Shirtleth. And in November of 1776, Margaret Corbin was manning a cannon beside her husband when he was killed at the Battle of Fort Washington. Without hesitation, she kept the cannon firing in the failing defense of New York Harbor until she herself was struck by grapeshot, her arm nearly severed by the cluster of munitions that also struck her chest and jaw. After her company surrendered, she was paroled and joined the Corps of Invalids, who garrisoned West Point for 7 years. Her fellow artillerymen recalled that she was illiterate, but that she could drink and smoke and swear as well as any soldier. They called her Captain Molly. She got a soldier's pension. All three did. They each left a paper trail in their lifetimes and had contemporary notoriety. Alexander Hamilton's wife recalled meeting the stout, red-headed and freckled Irish Captain Molly several times. And Margaret Corbin was still being referred to as Captain Molly throughout the 1830s. Eliza Hamilton's interview where she recalled the meetings was in 1848. The Revolution was still in living, though increasingly elderly, memory. Captain Molly seems like our smoking gun, right? So where did the pitcher name come from? And why is the battle applied to Monmouth almost 2 years later? Normally, we could blame sexism for stripping the captain part, right? Or some new flavor of religion for the feminine energy of a pitcher instead of a more sensible bucket. But in this case, the answer might be even more stupid. In the fall of 1760, a cordwainer's daughter married one of her father's apprentices. Normally, this blasé moment in the lives of some random shoemakers living in a rural Massachusetts leather tanning hamlet more than 250 years ago would not be historically interesting. Except that this apprentice's surname was Pitcher, and the cordwainer's daughter went by Moll. And over the course of 50 years, Moll Pitcher would rise to household fame throughout New England for the accuracy of her tea leaf reading as the granddaughter of a wizard. She was consulted for everything from love affairs to solving crimes to massive business decisions, while also making fun of anybody who wanted her to help them find buried treasure. It was said that there was not a port in Europe into which American vessels sailed that had not heard of the wonderful powers of Moll Pitcher. Ship owners would seek her out to predict the fortunes of their voyages, and crews would refuse to serve on vessels with ill omens. Noblemen visiting from Europe would swing by for their futures. America's first rich, infamous wackadoo, Timothy Dexter, was said to trust her predictions implicitly. And, per New England folklore, she was escorted to meet George Washington at Bunker Hill, and correctly predicted the outcomes of early Revolutionary battles, as well as passing British secrets on to Washington throughout the war. Moll Pitcher, the Oracle of Lynn, died in 1813. Captain Molly was still Captain Molly, but for some reason, Moll Pitcher really lingered in the collective memory of New England. There's a 900-line poem about her published in 1832, a 4-act play written in 1839 that toured the country and packed theaters in major cities for decades. Nathaniel Hawthorne referenced her in 2 separate novels in the 1850s. There's an 1895 book about her prophecies, and multiple newspapers and magazine articles about her throughout the mid to late 1800s. And right at the center of all that weird craze, the famous lithograph titled Molly Pitcher, the Heroine of Monmouth, is published. Which kinda makes it seem probable that in the course of recalling half-remembered oral traditions, Captain Molly got linguistically hijacked by Moll Pitcher's name. The water-carrying component of the story is literally in the name. And for a generation more removed from warfare than any since America's Revolution, the idea that cannons intrinsically needed buckets full of water to operate would probably spring less to mind than, say, Monmouth, a battle so infamously hot that more soldiers died of heat stroke than of lead shot. And yeah, the idea of some tradwife battlefield angel delivering water to parched and dying heroes provides a seemingly period-appropriate, delicately feminine way to cleanly explain away the presence of a woman on the battlefield, when you don't want to know any better. And a woman like Mary Hayes, who after the war returned to a farm and raised a kid, was a lot easier and entirely too dead to resist being shoved into that Molly Pitcher role over the swearing, hard-drinking, half-pensioned, disfigured soldier living in the barracks that was Molly Corbin. For a nation so very in love with its own myth-making, creeping towards its first centennial while simultaneously racing along the unavoidable precipice of civil war for decades, this Frankenstein concept of Molly Pitcher was kind of perfect. It's also the same impulse which makes research way harder. Like Europe of the 1780s, an individual's literacy in the colonies was more dependent on their affluence and general geography. Because the Puritans who founded the colonies in New England thought that the ability to read the Bible was an integral part of one's salvation, a primary school level education was the expectation for everyone within the community. Even after Puritanism faded, those values more or less remained. And even now, globally, we do know that a parent's literacy level is the single best statistical predictor of the literacy outcomes for their children. But even in the North, once you add in the factors like recent immigration, the cost of paper, the free time to write, or even the lack of consistent storage and simple exposure to good old American heat and humidity, it's not terribly shocking that we lack first-hand accounts from a domestic servant or a longshoreman. And even if we did, people don't exactly write the detailed minutiae of everyday life in their diaries with the expectation that some random person 250 years later is going to try to use it as an instruction manual on how to harness a horse or make a bed. Which, when it comes to history for less historically significant people, means that we're heavily reliant on suppositions, generalizations, and family stories, which we have to thank for so many of the women that I detailed today. Where the problem arises is the differing levels of academic rigor which we apply when verifying or debunking these tales. Very definitely fake stories like George Washington praying alone out loud during the winter at Valley Forge receive very little pushback compared to any moderately famous female patriot. So much of the discourse over Molly Pitcher revolves around who the real Molly was, and misses the point entirely. The historical disservice isn't in recounting the story of Molly Pitcher, or even by inadequately challenging its validity. She's merely a reaction to the way we tell history, so often dismissing stories that don't cleanly fit within the mold of the great man narrative. And in so doing, we fail to tell the very real stories of ordinary everyday people living in the margins, people whose contributions matter, not just in the moment, but to people listening 250 years later, who know for a fact that humans who looked and thought and felt like them existed, yet never get mentioned. And hear the implicit message that history isn't for them, when in reality, historians need to do better than write the 930th biography about George Washington.
Stop it. Get some help.